Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Al Fadi, and this is another episode of our brand new series that we have titled The Qibla Controversy. In past few episodes, we walked you through a journey concerning the controversy that arose since we basically published the videos on our channel, Sira International, that we call The Unknown History of Islam, where we used most of the material by Dan Gibson concerning the geography of the Quran and the problems in there. And also we focused about Mecca and the fact that the Mecca of the Quran really does not match, technically speaking, the actual Mecca location, whereby Petra is the possible, at least, city that fits those descriptions found in the Quran. And then, to support that, Dan Gibson did other research concerning the direction of Qibla, and what do you know? He discovered that at least early mosques were facing towards Petra. So we did a series concerning the direction of Qibla. Out of that, since we published it back in April of 2018, one of the foremost scholars in the Qibla, his name is Dr. David King, issued I would say a rebuke, if you wish, an academic rebuke of Dan Gibson. And I have here Dr. J. Smith with me, and thankfully he's handing me the paper. Basically, this is what David King invested, about 52 pages of rebuking the findings of Dan Gibson. So what we did, this series that we call the Qibla Controversy, is that we looked at David King's responses and his attempt to refute the actual findings. And I say actual because Dan Gibson went to these sites and did a lot of studies, supported his work in the book that he published called the Qibla, and have data, satellite imaging, and so many other things. And we contrast the two basically analytical studies, the studies of Dan Gibson and the refutation of David King, and we basically left it up to you as our intelligent audience, which we believe in you, to make your final decision, technically speaking. Our job is really to present the facts. We're not siding with anyone. But at the same time, I think it will become abundantly clear to you at the end of this series, as we conclude basically this series, that it doesn't take pretty much a genius to figure out who did the work and who did not. Today, we are going to venture into another side of Dr. David King's, and we called this particular episode, King's Hates Everybody. King Hates Everybody. And with me here is Dr. J. Smith to further expound on what we mean by that.
Yeah, now, to be fair, he doesn't hate everybody. I'm sure there are a lot of people he loves. He hates anybody or everybody that disagrees with him.
Everybody that disagrees with him.
There you go. And this is what we're finding out. And I think we need to bring this up. There is a real problem here with King. Even with as we said earlier, even with this title, early mosques do face the sacred Kaaba in Mecca. He's very clear. They all face the Kaaba in Mecca, but Dan Gibson doesn't know how. And in some ways, I can see even that title is contradictory because he spends then 52 pages showing how they don't face Mecca, which goes against...
And explains away why they don't face Mecca.
And seven different ways that he came up with that they don't face Mecca, and every one of them Gibson has responded to quite knowledgeably. And it's fascinating to me that he would then say, "But Dan Gibson doesn't know how" as part of the title. Yeah. This is ad hominem. There's no reason for this.
Absolutely, Jay. Let me ask a quick question. As the foremost authority on Qibla, was anyone aware of his 7 theories before this particular study by Dan Gibson?
I can't answer that because I was never one of his students. Okay. I've not read his book. This is not my area of expertise. Okay. Dan Gibson could probably answer that question, and that may be a question you may want to pose to him. What Dan does say in his videos, by the way, for those who are interested, Dan Gibson has put up 6 videos on his site. Dan Gibson, just put up Dan Gibson on YouTube. You'll go right to his sites. They have a kind of bluish-greenish background to all of them, garish, greenish, bluish. Those are the ones where he is responding. And what's fascinating to me is look at the way he responds. He doesn't use any of this vitriol, not once. He doesn't use any bad language. He doesn't even get angry. But you can see he's very hurt. And I was feeling sorry for Gibson when I was watching these video series, because it's obviously this kind of vitriol is not something Gibson's used to. We're used to that. We get it all the time,
Sadly,
don't we? Yeah. Every morning when you wake up and you look at the notes or the responses to your videos, the same way. If you look at all those responses, there's hatred there all the time. I have been going to Speaker's Corner for 25 years, getting on that ladder and hearing the spew after spew, week after week, of just visceral hatred of me as a person. People who give me death threats, people who give me all kinds of threats. I got beat up a number of times at Speaker's Corner. I've had glasses broken. You can see where they try to open up my throat. The Muslims try to open my throat a number of years ago there at Speaker's Corner. So this is something we're used to. It's something that we have. It's part of our ministry. We assume it. Gibson's not used to this kind of stuff. He's not. And you can see his responses are skewed towards that, trying to respond as best he can. What he does do, and this is why it's so important that we do what we're doing, we're actually going and taking the responses and we're giving it a whole nother platform for it.
Correct.
And that's important, because it's obvious to me that this is very emotional. King's response. King's response is very emotional. This is not a good academic response. What's more, it's obvious to me that King was taken by surprise. I don't think he was ever expecting anybody to ever controvert any of his material. It's obvious to me that he has had a very acquiescent, many very acquiescent students in his class. And I don't think anybody has ever confronted him before with what he's come up with.
And by the way, we want to be fair. I mean, we're both in the academic field. And let's say tomorrow you or myself discover something and one of our students or someone later comes and refute it. Hey, that's the academic world. I mean, that's
called peer review.
That's expected.
And you have to do that, and you have to be ready for it. And if you're really a true academic, you better be getting ready for it, because especially in this area, and I'm saying this specifically to Muslims, in the area of Islam, whenever anybody is critical of anything Islamic, well, how you dress, how you walk, how you talk, how you eat, you name it. And especially if you're critical of Islam's precedents, or Islam's emergent, or Islam's history, or Islam's theology, or Islam's prophet, Muhammad. If you're critical of any of those things, you get an enormous reaction, enormous vitriolic reaction, and it's way too emotional to be true until you realize that for Muslims, they're just not used to this kind of reaction. And one of the reasons why is because when you do get this kind of reaction, they put fatwas on your head. And when they put fatwas on your head, you can get killed. And there have been people who have been killed. I mean, the Salman Rushdie affair is probably a case in point. That was all over the news.
Now, he wasn't killed, but he went into hiding.
He wasn't killed because of the fact he was under protection. The British government protected him for 10 years. He was under house protection.
That's right.
His house had to have guards in front of it. It's fascinating that any citizen should have to live like that. And the reason, and of course, this was all over the media, so much so that everybody is reticent to criticize Islam. And if you grow up in that type of atmosphere, and there has been now 2 or 3 generations of Muslims that have grown up never having to had anything reviewed or peer reviewed. And if you are an academic like King is, who is a defender of Islam, to look at his work, all of his work is there to defend the integrity of Islam. I don't see anything very critical at all in any of his work. And everything that I've heard, all the criticism is against this, of people who dare to question his work.
Right. And that basically the topic of today. So what did we mean, or what did we both mean that he hated everybody who criticized him?
No, let's take in point 3 people especially. He really has it in. Well, there's 4 people, but I'm going to look at the first 3. He really has it in for 3 scholars. These are brilliant scholars.
Revisionists.
These are revisionists. Let's go ahead and put their picture up on the. There you can see them right there. That's Dr. John Wansborough on the left, Dr. Michael Cook in the middle, and Dr. Patricia Corona on the right. Now, Dr. John Wansborough came out with 2 books in the 1970s. which were called Quranic Studies, and the other one was called Sector and Milieu. It's in 1976 and 1977.
And it's a groundbreaking, by the way.
It was the first of its kind. He was the first one to actually confront this notion that there was a man named Muhammad who received a revelation from 610 to 632. That revelation then was written down between 632 and 634. Had to be rewritten a second time in 652 under Uthman. That's the classic account of the Quran.
And he basically pointed out that we don't have anything earlier than at least maybe 100 to 200 years to collaborate any of the history that supposedly took place.
Really,
Yeah.
what he did with the Quran, Gibson is doing with Islam.
Exactly.
They're doing the same thing.
Right.
They're asking very good historical questions.
Correct.
How can you have all these stories, Wansborough says, in the Quran that are biblical? Really, they are biblical characters. Abraham,
Right.
and you have characters like Moise and Yahya. These are great stories, but they don't follow at all the biblical account. And this is something we've known. You know, I know this. When you look at the stories in the Quran, they don't follow the biblical account at all. They're completely different stories, but we do know where they come from. And these stories come from Jewish apocryphal account. But as John Wansborough, and that's been well known since the 1800s. But John Wansborough says, "No, wait a minute. In all my studies, I'm an expert in this area. These apocryphal accounts would not have existed in the Hijaz that early. They would not have had access to these kind of stories until at least the 8th or 9th century. So how could they be in a Quran that was finished in the 7th century?"
Yeah, in other words, 200 to 300 years, all of a sudden you have a fixed account now of things that were dated before.
Yeah.
Taking it backward, basically.
Two of his students are Dr. Michael Cook and Dr. Patricia Corona that you see there on the screen. They were two of his best students there at School of Oriental and African Studies there in London at the University of London. And they got their doctorates there, their PhDs, at that time the best school in the world for Islamic studies and for the study of the Middle East. Now, Cook and Crone are considered to be two of the best minds in the in this area of expertise. Dr. Patricia Corona, you see on the right there, she's Danish. And she knows, reads and writes 15 archaic languages.
She passed away, by the way.
She just passed away 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yes.
She reads and writes 15 languages. How many people do you know that can read and write 15? Now, these aren't just modern day languages. These are archaic, ancient languages.
That's right. And one of her really premier findings is that she looked at all of the trade maps and she couldn't find Mecca in any of them.
Well, she didn't just look at the trade maps. She went through all the trading documents from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. All those centuries where this trade was supposed to be moving, and all the Nabatean traders, she could read the original documents. She knew Aramaic. She knew Syriac. These are the languages you have to know. Not many Muslims know these languages. They only know Arabic. She knew many more languages than them, and she went to the original documentation, and she was the first one to say that there is no reference to a city called Mecca at all in any of these documents.
That's correct.
And yet these people were trading all over. She was the one that found that there were people from Ctesiphon, which is modern-day Baghdad. These were the Sassanids. The Sassanians were the Persians, the Zoroastrians. They had come down to Medina. Medina is just northeast of Mecca. They'd come down to Medina and found silver mines there.
I think you're talking about Asfahan, basically. That's the Arabic word for it. And that's the area.
Yathrib.
And Yathrib, exactly.
Yathrib is the city they came down to.
I'm talking about from the area that they came from.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yes.
They came to Yathrib, which is now Medina today.
Correct.
But Yathrib, they found silver mines there, and they actually opened up silver mines. And they went up to Tabuk, and they went up to Khaybar in the north. And they came down to Taif in the south. They went as far down as Najran. They mentioned these areas. No
and
reference.
From China. There are people that came from China as well.
No reference to any place called Mecca at all.
And remember what I mentioned the other day, Jay. I mean, we know, and even Islamic sources say there were Jewish tribes around Yathrib, Medina. If Mecca was associated with Abraham, why do you think the Jews didn't make it down there? He is a big deal for them.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that.
Everybody knows that he is obviously Abraham is also the father of their faith as well. The father as far as they're in the ancestry through Isaac. Now, can you see then what she was saying, what she came up with? She didn't just make a supposition. She wrote a book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987. Because she saw some real problems when she looked at maps and realized that all the trade routes that she had come across in her studies, none of them, though they came up to Taif, they start there in Aden, they go up to Sana, Najran, and they come up to Taif. From Taif, according to the Islamic traditions, according to all the classical account, they had to go down 1,000 meters to get down to Mecca, and then had to come back up 1,000 meters to get back up to Yathrib. And there's nothing in Mecca that would accommodate these caravans.
And you brilliantly pointed out that, I mean, they would have taken the Red Sea and just parked at every port, and that's it.
There were no
Problem
ports.
solved.
There were no ports.
Yeah.
All the ports were in Africa. All the ports were in Andalusia.
That's right.
They're on the wrong side of the Red Sea because the Arabs were not necessarily well known for it. They were not great they were not boat people. I know Muslims have hated me for saying this, but if you take a look at archaic maps, how many ports are there on the coasts of Arabia? Today, Jeddah is there, but that didn't used to be there.
Exactly. You have Jeddah, you have Yamba, and maybe one down south. But that's about, you're right.
These are modern ports.
These
I
live by the port
ancient.
of Jeddah myself.
These are not ancient ports. The ancient ports didn't exist because they were camel herders. They were people who traveled the deserts.
Right.
And that's why she brought up this question. I can't see this in any of the documentation from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. She went to all the centuries. She went over and she even looked at the trading documents from India, because that's where the trade was coming from.
Correct.
From China through India,
the spices,
across the Arabian
the
Sea.
silk, jewelry, everything.
She couldn't find any. She spent a chapter in her book, a chapter per spice, trying to find out where these 15 spices were that all the Muslims have said was what made Mecca rich. None of them came from the Hijaz. 2 of them came from the southern part of Arabia, the Hadramaut today. That's Yemen and
it makes sense for
Oman.
Yemen, because Yemen also, you can take the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf.
Exactly,
Go all the
and
way
those
down.
are ports. Those are port cities.
And Eden
they
was
would have a
there,
trade.
Yeah.
And that's just frankincense and myrrh. All the other spices either came from India or they came from Africa. They all went up the Red Sea. Now, she was the first one to mention that. She destroyed Montgomery Watt's trade route theory, the great trade route theory that all revisionists that I had to learn when I was studying under Dr. Gerald Otting there at SOAS, and I studied under him. That's in 1994, 1995. And this is the trade route theory that I was coming up with, that I was hearing. But Otting says there's a problem with this trade route theory, and then he quoted Patricia Corona.
Yeah. And she received a lot of flack for.
Not only she received flack, she got death threats.
That's right.
She got death threats. She had to leave Oxford and move over to Cambridge, because it became just too volatile for her. And, I have to sit and ask, why in the world would people want to kill somebody for what they're finding?
And she, by the way, I did look at the chapters that you're talking about. She never once attacked Islam, attacked the Prophet of Islam, or anything. She's just raising questions as a scholar, asking questions. That's it.
In 1977, she and Dr. Cook, let's put their images back up again. In 1977, she and Dr. Cook, Michael Cook and Crone, who had been students together under John Wansborough's tutelage. And of course, it was John Wansborough that broke this all open, and that's why studying under him, they realized we've got some real problems. John Wansborough didn't just find out difficulties with these stories. He found out lots of literature. He took an awful lot of literature, and he says a lot of the literature just could not have existed in that part of the world that early. Later, yes, but not that early for the Quran to have incorporated it, unless, of course, the Quran is written much later. And so he had the audacity, as what everybody's saying, to suggest that maybe the Quran was written at a later date. So he was the one that actually started this idea. It was Cook and Crone that came up with a book called Hagerism, where they wanted to go one step further, and they did. And they said in the very first pages, this is a what-if scenario. That's what they did. This is a what-if scenario. This is what we think from everything that we've got today. In 1977, this is what we think happened. And, of course, the whole thing of Hagerism is incorrect. They have now said that this part is not correct. But all the data that they looked at is still correct. They're not changing that. Now, what does King do with this? And this is where we're going to come back. What King does, I want to look at this quote that he says about these people. This is the quote he gives in his paper.
And if I may interject one more thing. The work that you and I did from the book, if we can take Dan Brubaker's book, if you don't mind showing it, work by Dr. Brubaker is also, even though it's directed towards the early Quranic manuscript, is kind of like confirming some of these findings, because we begin to find that corrections were being made to the early Quranic manuscripts until you get to a fixed era. And the Quran becomes kind of like less edits and more adjustments to readings and things like that. So all the findings that are appearing right now lead to what Wansborough was saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it all fits. The documentary evidence is amalgamated with the manuscript evidence, is amalgamated with the archaeological evidence, it's amalgamating with all the historical evidence. This is why it's so beautiful that and we're going to continue doing this. We're going to have in fact, there's so much new material coming out that we have to keep doing gradations of new discoveries.
Exactly.
And you're going to hear more and more. Almost every time we come up, we're going to have a whole nother section coming up in the spring on some new material that I can't even divulge right now because it's just coming to the fore.
Right.
But let's get back to King.
And that's our style. We like to make sure that we have everything supported by evidence.
Okay. So King says this. This is what he says about Wansboro, Cook, and Corona. Some 50 years ago, and this is a direct quote from his paper, Petrofallacy.
Right.
Some 50 years ago, some over-enthusiastic London-based Arabists, Dr. John Wansboro and his students Michael Cook and Patricia Corona, came up with the idea that Islam began not in Mecca, but somewhere unspecified in northwest Arabia. This was a curious idea, he says, not least because there was no obvious potential sites. One of the principal and most convincing arguments for their bold assertion was the fact, in quotations he put, in other words, this is their fact, that the earliest mosques in Egypt and Iraq do not face Mecca, but rather some locality in northwest Arabia.
Guess what? We know the identity of the northwest site in Arabia now, don't we?
There you go. Thanks to Gibson.
Yeah.
Gibson has really taken on what Patricia Corona and Cook said back in the 1970s, and he has gone. Now, I don't think he knew about Corona and Cook. He did. I've never heard him say. We can ask him that question because he was starting this in the 1980s, and he worked up until 2004, and he's still studying him today. That was the 25 years that he incorporated into this book here, Quranic. The Quranic geography book.
Right. And Dr. J, what was their at least alarming, finding? Wansboro and his students, they noticed the direction of Qibla.
2 mosques in Iraq
Right.
and 1 mosque in Egypt.
That's
the
right.
2 mosques, and these were not their findings. Yeah. This is Creswell and Fehérvadi who found this in 1905.
That's right.
Creswell and Fehérvadi were actually on site. They were actually the ones looking, and they were digging down to the original floor plans of both the Kufa Mosque and the Wasit Mosque, which we've talked about, the Between Mosque.
Exactly.
And they noticed that they were not facing Mecca. If they're over in Iraq, they should be facing straight south, but they were facing this direction. They were facing east. And so they said, this is a problem. They didn't say why, and they guessed it was probably because they were facing Jerusalem. This must be the first Qibla that chapter 2, verse 149,
That's right.
150 is referring to. That was their summation because they didn't have any of the GPS coordinates. They didn't have the Astra satellites that Gibson has today. They didn't have this really modern material. They only could guess. They went over to Egypt, to Fustat, which is the garrison town outside of Cairo.
And the same thing happened, facing also not towards Mecca.
It was facing straight west.
You would think.
I'm sorry, I got it wrong.
East, yeah.
First east, and the one in Iraq were facing west.
Correct. So you would think the Qibla expert would have at least provided explanations for that.
So this is 1905. King comes up and says, 50 years ago, that these over-enthusiastic. Hold on, King. Have you looked at your own material? Have you done any of your studies? This is not Crone and Cook that came up with this material. This is not John Wansboro. This is Creswell. And this is Fehérvadi, who you quote all the time. In fact, you yourself quote Creswell all the time. Why don't you read all of Creswell's? Because their response was, these are not at all facing towards Mecca. Now, so you've got to look at the evidence that's on the ground. So he lambasts them, and he says that they are over-enthusiastic, and that their only reasoning for believing it was in northwest Arabia is because of these mosques.
And by the way, it would have alarmed
these
me.
Qiblas, which is his area.
That's right.
This is his very area of expertise. Of all people, he should have been humble enough to say, okay, well, I got it wrong on this.
Well, that's an interesting find. Let me go and find out why. And by the way, even if you came to me today and says, by the way, we think they're facing toward Jerusalem, you know what my push will be? Wait a minute. I thought the direction of Qibla changed before the death of the Prophet. Why are they still facing Jerusalem?
That's right. The Prophet died in 32, and the change came around 624. So we can. I want to in the next episode. I want to see what he does with Gibson, because he really says some nasty things about Gibson. But it's obviously that from what we're seeing here, that he does not like anybody that controverts his ideas.
Very good. Well, why don't we wrap it up here, and next week, when we do the next episode, we'll focus on his response towards Gibson. And I want to be clear. Me and Dr. J are not really attacking anybody here, but we're pointing out the obvious. And by the way, the stuff that we're talking about comes from here. It's right here. It's written in this document, right? You can download it, actually. So we're not really fabricating facts. You can go and read for yourself and judge for yourself the kind of language that is being used. It really breaks my heart as a young scholar that someone who is supposedly the foremost authority on Qibla and in the academic field would use language like this, actually. And we need to unpack this next time.
It gets worse. Wait till the next episode. We're going to show you just how dangerous this kind of language gets.
Yes. So hopefully you'll join us next time. Until then, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching. Please like our video, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Sira International. And be sure also to click the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we upload new videos into the channel. And finally, I like to prayerfully encourage you to become a patron through Patreon. Your giving is much needed and will enable us to produce more and more of videos like this so that we can publish them on a weekly basis. So thank you in advance.